The day my podcast hit #1 on Apple's charts was the same day Mayor Richardson called an emergency town meeting about me. I sat in my car outside the community center, watching half the town file in through those double doors, their faces twisted with the same disgust they'd worn for the past 18 years. They had no idea I was recording everything. My name is Ethan Marchetti, and for most of my life, I was Millbrook's favorite punching bag. Not because I'd done anything wrong. I was just different, too quiet, too observant, too much like my mother, who died when I was 7 under circumstances the town preferred not to discuss. Growing up in a small town sounds idyllic until you realize that being different makes you a target. And in Millbrook, population 8,000, I was the bullseye everyone aimed for. It started small when I was a kid. Other children would knock my lunch tray over. Teachers would roll their eyes when I raised my hand. Parents would pull their kids away when I walked by. By high school, it had evolved into something darker. Coach Stevens would make me run extra laps for no reason, shouting that I needed to toughen up. My locker would mysteriously fill with garbage. Even adults participated. Mr. Chen at the grocery store would follow me around like I was going to steal something. And Mrs. Patterson at the library would claim all the study rooms were booked whenever I tried to reserve one. The worst part was how coordinated it felt. Like the entire town had held a meeting and decided I was the designated outcast. My dad tried to shield me from it, but he was fighting his own battles. After Mom died, he'd never been the same. He worked double shifts at the plant just to avoid the whispers and stares. I learned to become invisible. I'd eat lunch in empty classrooms, take the long way home to avoid Main Street, and spend most of my time in my room with headphones on. Music became my escape, then podcasts. I'd listen to people telling stories, sharing experiences, connecting with strangers across the world. It was everything Millbrook wasn't. The breaking point came during my senior year. It was Spirit Week, and someone had nominated me for Homecoming King as a joke. The whole school thought it was hilarious. They actually campaigned for me, putting up posters with the worst photos they could find. When they announced my name at the assembly, the entire gymnasium erupted in laughter. I stood up because I had to. Walking to that stage felt like walking through quicksand. Principal Morrison was trying not to smile as he placed that cheap plastic crown on my head. The laughter got louder. Someone started slow clapping. Then they all joined in. This mocking, synchronized applause that felt like hammers against my skull. That's when Brittany Chen, yes, the grocery store owner's daughter, dumped a bucket of syrup over my head. It had been sitting there the whole time, right beside the podium. The principal had known. They'd all known. I stood there dripping, the crown sliding off my sticky hair, and something inside me finally snapped, but not in the way they expected. I didn't cry. I didn't run. I just looked at them, all of them, and smiled, because in that moment, I realized I had been documenting everything. Years of casual cruelty, recorded in my journal. Names, dates, incidents. Without meaning to, I'd been building a case study of small-town mob mentality. I walked off that stage with my head high, syrup pooling in my shoes with every step. When I got home, I set up my laptop in my closet, the only place I could get decent sound isolation, and recorded my first episode. I called it The Syrup Crown and told the whole story. Not with anger, but with the kind of detached analysis you'd use for a nature documentary. The day my podcast hit #1 on Apple's charts was the same day Mayor Richardson called an emergency town meeting about me. I sat in my car outside the community center, watching half the town file in through those double doors, their faces twisted with the same disgust they'd worn for the past 18 years. They had no idea I was recording everything. I talked about mob psychology, about how groups create outcasts to maintain social cohesion. I used Millbrook as a case study without naming it directly, describing how a town of 8,000 could sustain a 2-decade bullying campaign against a child who'd lost his mother. I included the smaller details, the synchronized cruelty, the adult participation, the institutional support from school officials. I uploaded it expecting nothing. Maybe a few psychology students would find it interesting. But something about the way I told it, calm, analytical, but with this undercurrent of lived pain, resonated. The episode got 50 downloads the first day, then 500, then 5,000. Comments started pouring in. People sharing their own stories of small-town persecution. Others fascinated by the psychological dynamics. Some were just there for the drama, calling it better than any true crime podcast. They wanted more, so I gave them more. Episode 2 was about Coach Stevens and his special brand of physical humiliation. Episode 3 covered the local businesses that had made my life hell. I never used real names or identified the town, but I painted a picture so vivid that listeners felt like they were there. My style evolved. I'd weave in research about group dynamics, historical examples of scapegoating, quotes from psychologists and sociologists. But the backbone was always my story, told with this eerie calm that listeners found addictive. They said it was like listening to someone perform their own autopsy. By episode 10, I had sponsors reaching out, real companies wanting to advertise. The podcast was charting on Apple, climbing past established shows. My Instagram, created reluctantly, gained thousands of followers overnight. They called themselves Syrup Crown Survivors and shared their own experiences of systematic exclusion. That's when things got interesting in Millbrook. It started with whispers. Someone's cousin in Chicago had mentioned a podcast about a bullied kid. The details sounded familiar, too familiar. People started listening, trying to figure out if it was about our town. The more they listened, the more uncomfortable they got. I knew they were catching on when I walked into Chen's grocery, and Mr. Chen actually smiled at me. First time in 18 years. Mrs. Patterson suddenly had study rooms available at the library. Coach Stevens nodded at me on the street instead of spitting on the ground. They were scared. Episode 15 was when I got specific. I talked about the Christmas pageant when I was 9, how the entire town had laughed when my costume, deliberately sabotaged, fell apart on stage. I described the pattern of flat tires my dad's truck suffered whenever he defended me publicly. I detailed the time the town council tried to use zoning laws to force us to move. The podcast hit number 1 on Apple's society and culture charts that week. Major publications started covering it. The bullied kid who became a podcasting sensation, read one headline. How one teen turned his trauma into a chart-topping show, read another. That's when Mayor Richardson called the emergency town meeting. I sat in my car, watching them file in, and decided to attend. Why not? I had nothing left to fear from these people. I walked in just as the mayor was starting his speech about protecting the town's reputation and the danger of one-sided narratives. Every head turned when I entered. The silence was thick enough to cut. I found a seat in the back, pulled out my phone, and obviously started recording. A few people shifted nervously. Mayor Richardson cleared his throat and continued, but his words had lost their power. He talked about community values, about the importance of supporting each other, about how outsiders wouldn't understand the dynamics of a small town. It was almost laughable, considering those same dynamics had made my life hell. Then Brittany Chen stood up, the syrup girl herself, now working at her father's store. She looked at me, then at the room, and said something unexpected. She wanted to apologize, not just for the syrup, but for everything. She talked about how they'd all gotten caught up in it, how it had become normal to treat me badly, how listening to the podcast had made her realize how sick it all was. Others started standing, some to apologize, some to defend themselves, some to blame others. The meeting devolved into chaos, accusations flying, old grievances surfacing. 20 years of complicity was unraveling in real time. I stood up and walked out. I didn't need their apologies or their excuses. The podcast had already given me what I needed: a voice, an audience, and the knowledge that I wasn't alone. The next episode broke download records. I played audio from the meeting, analyzing how the town's unity fractured when faced with external judgment. The sponsors increased their offers. Publishing houses wanted a book deal. Netflix called about a documentary. But the real victory came in the messages. Thousands of them, from kids and adults who'd been where I was. They thanked me for giving words to their experience, for showing them they weren't crazy, for proving that the problem wasn't them. I still live in Millbrook, partly because my dad needs me, partly because leaving would feel like letting them win, but mostly because I'm not the same scared kid anymore. Now when I walk down Main Street, people step aside. Not from disgust, but from something else. Respect mixed with fear, mixed with shame. The podcast is still going strong, expanding beyond my story to feature other survivors of systematic bullying. We're building a community of the excluded, turning our isolation into connection. Every episode is a reminder that the quiet kids are listening, learning, and waiting. Sometimes I touch the cheap plastic crown I kept from that horrible day. It sits on my desk next to my podcasting setup, my syrup crown, symbol of the worst day of my life and the birth of something bigger than anyone could have imagined. The town that tried to break me accidentally created something they never saw coming. A voice they couldn't silence, amplified by thousands who'd been waiting for someone to say what they'd been feeling all along. They picked the wrong quiet kid to mess with. We're not so quiet anymore.